Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream about philosophy. I'm trying to do a series of discussions with philosophers. I didn't think that I would ever be involved in philosophy. My mother was a philosophy professor in Oxford, and I always used to say when I was a kid, "There's the one thing I'll never do when I'm grown up, it's be a philosopher." But here I am. I've been kind of led to this by a bunch of science that I've done, and I've gotten fairly interested from kind of the scientific angle of thinking about metaphysics and so on. It's like, what have philosophers already figured out? Because I know none of that stuff. And what I'm sort of hoping is both to be able to contextualize things I'm understanding scientifically, and if we're really lucky, to be able to see that something somebody figured out 200 years ago is something that immediately gives us insight that's useful for the science we're trying to do today. So today we have Christopher Seiberth with us, and I guess we'll be talking about all kinds of philosophical questions. And I think maybe to launch, I had sort of an idea for a question I thought we might discuss. What is your view of what a concept is? Or is that a
Yeah,
horribly difficult question?
Stephen, good to be here. And as you can imagine, it's a question I, as a matter of fact, like a great deal. In the tradition in which I work, a concept is very much akin to what in hypergraph theory is a particle in Reuliet space, you could say. So it is what, in one sense, gives rise to particular pathways that you can go, but it's also what comes into existence when pathways cross each other. And then you could say a concept is a powerful position from which you can monitor things, but which you also will strive to arrive at. And so I believe one good way of entry into a philosophical perspective on concepts is quite obviously via representation, where you say a concept represents a snippet of reality. But then, in another sense, a concept is also what organizes or is the result of an act of inferring, an inference. And then there's a peculiar, let's say, discovery that's very young, and I'm excited to talk to you about, which is that some concepts are the endpoint of a long intellectual pursuit, and they stand as the conclusion, as the arrival, point of arrival. But when you zoom out and you look at the wider context, then they are suddenly premises in a larger enterprise. And that's kind of nice, because if you think about this, take our conversation here, something that we arrive at will hopefully be something that people can use as future premises in their own argument.
So let's try and unpack some of this. So the first thing you said is a concept is kind of a packaging of a bundle of patch of reality. Is
Yeah.
that so? So, for example, you say a tree, and there is, the tree has a lot of atoms in it and bark and all this kind of thing. And somehow, first question is a particular tree, and the second thing will be the concept of a tree.
Yeah.
And I think you're probably wanting to distinguish those things. So the concept of a tree is not a particular patch of reality. It is somehow a class of patches of reality. Is that a fair characterization, or is that or do you want to? I mean, when you think of a concept, it is a collective kind of thing. It is not a singular. It is not that particular tree from which the apple fell on Newton's head or something. It is the concept of a tree. Is that fair distinction to make?
Yeah. I mean, so my impression was that you might have interest in Kantian, in a Kantian school of thought about this. And when you liken a concept to, let's say, a means for representation, there is a good way to distinguish between two sub forms of representation, which is on the one hand the representing and the representat. That's the act content distinction. And when you speak of concept, it's ambiguous between these two in a way.
So let
And
me try and unpack that because I'm
yeah,
I'm I'm pretty okay. So you're saying the represented or the act of representing. Is that
yes,
okay?
yes,
So the represented. So you imagine that the represented is a thing you might pick up and do something with, but the representing is you as a mind, for example, forming this thing that is your impression of the object. Is that, I mean, that wasn't a very good way of making that distinction. Maybe you
I know
can
it's a perfectly fine way of making that. So in a way, you would say of all the impressions arriving on your retina, some are selected, some are discarded, but most of them need to somehow be unified to stand as an object of which you then can say, it affected me, such that I am representing it. And so I believe in the tradition that we sometimes speak of as the German tradition of transcendental philosophy, this is talked to under the heading of the schematism, because you need that process of synthesis to somehow be organized by a schema. And then the distinction you raised earlier between an instance and a class would be a distinction in the degree of abstraction that you need to unify different instances of what you want to treat as the same experience. And so you need, as a way of working, you need top-level nodes to orchestrate and unify what happens at the bottom. And reading your work, I find that what you call equivalencing is very similar to what in the Kantian tradition you call the work of the schematism in the application of categories as higher order concepts for organizing experiences.
So let me see if I understand that. So the first thing you're saying is, I'm looking at a tree. There are
Yeah,
a bunch of pixels on my retina, that are firing, and as every moment I get certain different pixels firing, but I'm somehow going to integrate those to saying you say you're schematizing. You're saying somehow you have a schema that is the tree schema that somehow these collection of a very large collection of possible pixel configurations will all be schematized to the same thing that I interpret as a tree.
yeah,
And then you're saying, but you can easily generalize that from the thing that goes from pixels to a particular tree to the idea of pixels to anything of the class of things that I call a tree. Is
yeah.
that and that's the same type of idea of schematization from the particulars of the sort of sensory input, the particular points of sensory input to the thing that I call a tree. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, so you could say that the subdiscipline of epistemology would study this particular process as a process where you would want to distinguish between something that you use in your explanation and something that you would want to couch as prior in the order of being, such that you make a distinction between the order of explanation and the order of being, where in the order of being, there will be something affecting you, and in the order of explanation, you will arrive at the concept of a tree to have an explanation of what it is. And so you use the concept of a tree to parse that domain of reality such that you can treat it as causally affecting that particular perception in you.
Let me see if I can unpack that. And that sounds like it relates to your idea of a concept as the result of inference, so to speak, and a
Yeah,
concept, right? So what you're saying is that let me see if I can understand this. You're you're saying what it is that I mean, you're making a distinction between something that is somehow in an external reality and something that affects where you're saying I form this concept, for example, and then I build on it in my mind. I mean, maybe this is not quite the distinction you're trying to make, but there's one thing which is things. Okay, so one possibility is that I have I see the tree and something happens to the tree out in the real world. Another thing is that I form the concept of a tree, and then inside my mind, kind of deduce something about the tree. Maybe a better example than a tree would be something which is more capable of kind of logical deduction or some such other thing, where I could either have or something. No, maybe I try a different thing. Something that operates according to physical laws. So you could say either you drop the rock and it falls, and I could either say it is falling outside of me as a result of the operation of natural laws, or I could say I see the rock and I form the impression of the rock, and then I know, because I know something about natural laws, that I can deduce in my mind that the rock is going to fall. Is this the distinction you're making, or is this not? Is this a different kind of distinction?
Yeah, it is very much, let's say, an operation within the frame in which general epistemology would analyze what it is to take oneself to have a concept. But maybe I can draw attention to a fact that you're appealing to an everyday scenario in which there are trees, in which there are rocks, in which there are observers, and they do these things, and we all share a common understanding of that. And so that's why, in one way or another, we resort to what, in English philosophy, you would call middle-sized dry goods, as you mentioned Oxford earlier. That's an Oxford.
That's not a term I remember. It's nobody, the thing that's so weird for me about studying philosophy now is I haven't studied it ever before in my life, except that, I was I ran into many sort of the 1960s and 1970s, sort of a golden age of certain kind of philosophy in
Yeah,
Oxford.
indeed.
And so I ran into many of these philosophers who were at that time, to me, as a 10-year-old kid or something, were ancient people. And I would often end up talking to them, and they seemed to find it amusing to talk to the 10-year-old version of me. And
Yeah.
that's, but and then, so, these names that I see in the philosophical literature now, it's like, oh yeah, I knew that person's kids or whatever. But so
Wow.
I don't know that term. So explain that
Wow.
term to
Okay.
me.
So yeah, no, that was just to say that for most of the time when we want to talk about something, we start by appealing to middle-sized dry goods because all of us know those, all of us know the behavior roughly, and then there's a couple of features that we can appeal to in making our explanations,
So
and
what
then
wait a
we
minute, by
share
middle-sized dry goods, you mean things like balls
a
and
fountain pen,
shoes and things like this.
table.
Yes,
Yeah,
okay.
exactly. Yeah.
Fountain pen is kind of going that's going to be that's going to be an unknown thing in not too many years. But yeah, conceptually, right. I get the
Yeah, I
idea.
know I know
Yeah.
texts where they speak of the Mont Blanc, and you need to disambiguate between the mountain and the fountain pen there.
Yes,
So
yes.
that's receding into the back.
Length, okay, but
I
anyway,
wanted
so
to
yeah.
tell you something where maybe it's helpful for you to know because you said that you're interested in seeing how philosophy is doing all of this and what to uncoil and what to see,
Mhm.
such that, for instance, there would be insights that you have arrived at with research into the Rudyat, such that you could say, hey, this nicely tethers to what's going on,
Mhm.
or has been going on. And I was thinking, I tell you how inspiring for me hypergraph theory has been over the last years. And you could say it unlocked for me to understand that concepts, and you can allow various types of concepts for various types of things, right? Predicates and abstracta and so forth. But in philosophy, concepts often, especially names, are treated as nodes in a larger map of philosophical positions. And then you could say most of these names, like Kant and Hegel and Davidson and Quine and Russell and whoever was around at Oxford when you were around, they are associated with a way as placeholders for frameworks that have various, you could say, explanatory power.
Mhm.
And one way of thinking about it is to say, think about musical notation and geographical notation and the Principia Mathematica, but then also about natural language. So in some of these things, like musical notation, you can't write a poem, you can't write a letter, you can't do your taxes, meaning the frames vary with regard to what they can possibly express helpfully and what people can share in using those. And then you could think of the Kantian frame as something that's come to be fundamental ground for people to use specific concepts and treat themselves and each other as inferring in the same way. And that's
So let
very
me see if
much
I
the,
understand this. I mean,
yeah,
so what you're saying, I mean, often in the kind of philosophy of science literature, at least people talk about paradigms for thinking about things.
yeah,
And I think what you're saying is, there are these different frameworks, paradigms, whatever, for talking about different kinds of things, just as in some sense you might imagine different human natural languages as being different, somewhat equivalent, one usually imagines, if translation is possible between natural languages, and it is to a large extent,
Yeah.
then those are sort of frames that kind of overlap each other. And I think what you're saying is that in the case of some of these, philosophical paradigms, the ways that Kant talked about things are different from the ways that, I don't know, Quine talked about things.
Yeah.
And so trying to understand, I mean, to me, this question of translation is okay. So one case that is perhaps a couple of cases that are more formally defined. One is well, that's great. That's a cat joining us.
Oh yeah.
Hello. In any case,
More formally
you know,
defined, you said.
yeah, right. In mathematics, you might say we can talk about the Pythagorean theorem in algebraic terms, we can talk about it in geometrical terms. We think it's the same kind of thing. We think there is a translation from the algebraic description of geometry to the kind of geometric, standard geometric description of things, of plane figures or whatever else. And so that's a place where we can, where there's a sort of well understood translation mechanism from one frame, I think you're calling it, to another. I mean, the same kind of thing happens in, a world that I'm much involved in of computational language, where you say, this is a thing written in programming language X. Let's write the same thing in programming language Y. And
Yeah.
we can get a pretty good idea of whether those really are equivalent, because we can run the programs and we could say this one generates, 13 and the other one generates 45. They're not the same. Whereas, so I guess I'm curious in the thinking about that in terms of sort of philosophical frameworks, what, when you make a translation, or is there in fact if you were to translate from one philosophical framework to another, is that a meaningful kind of thing to talk about? Or do they discuss different kinds of things? I mean, you're using the example of musical notation not being capable of doing accounting.
Yeah.
Of course, there's a little bit of an exception to that, which is that old Kepler had his music of the spheres. I mean, in
Yeah.
his day, mathematical notation had not yet been well developed. And so when he was trying to describe, the periodic motions of planets and so on, he actually did that in musical notation. I mean, I think one of the things that's a lesson of, the world of computation is this notion of universal computation, which was a surprise. I mean, that it is possible to have very different underlying hardware systems that still can represent the same computations. In some sense, as soon as you've got a universal system, I would claim you can represent anything that is meaningful to represent in the world. That's a claim. I mean, in other words, so if you say, musical notation is not a computation universal system, it just doesn't have the machinery to do that. As soon as and human natural language is not presented, natural language on its own without the processing of the meaning of natural language is also not, in some sense, a universal computational system. But I think it has, given the processing of the meaning, I think it is. And when we look at, different computer languages or something, we'll see the same kind of thing. So I'm curious, it is probably the case that many philosophical systems could talk about anything, or maybe that's not the case. I mean, if I say, let's take Principia Mathematica of Whitehead and Russell, okay? And let's say, can it talk about ethics? The answer is probably, I don't know. The answer, it depends how you define ethics. I mean, on the face of it, the answer is no. Although then we get to people like, what was his name? Hans Freudenthal, who wrote this weird book about this thing he called interlingua, which was this, he called it the language for cosmic intercourse, which was a kind of an attempt. It was a formal language that was a thing to send to the extraterrestrials. This was a thing from the 1950s.
Wow.
That was, and it contained, I don't know whether it made any sense, but it contained, representations of ethics in kind of formal Whitehead Russell type form.
I
But I
see.
think you were perhaps making a different point. I mean, maybe you were making a point that these different philosophical traditions, in fact, don't cover. Do you think they do, in fact? I mean, to what extent are like a Kantian tradition, to what extent can you sort of think about anything in that tradition? Or is it something where it only talks about a particular domain of discourse?
Yeah, and I guess that's where I wanted to get at. So the point I wanted to make has two parts. And the first is the, you could say, expressive power of a specific framework. And I like your question as to translatability among these frameworks. In a way, you could say that's the business of doing philosophy on the ground, where in any institute colloquium scenario, you would meet people and then you would try to somehow negotiate explanatory dominion, who's got the better terms to capture what's going on. And then to some extent, you try to figure out, sorry, is this just a verbal dispute? Are we using different terms for the same thing? Or are we really talking past each other because we mean different things, although we use the same terms, right? These are somehow the two options there. And so there's a discovery, I think, that's come into view with hypergraph theory. And I wanted you to know about it because I was thinking this would be right on the money there. And it's to do with this idea that if it's true that philosophers mainly use philosophical texts as the framework of reference, certainly this is in a notional sense, right? They are educated, they're brought up. It's a bit of a priesthood scenario. You're ordained, you strive under someone's name, and then you have that smell and that kind of thing. But in the end, you could say whenever a philosophical text becomes canonical, becomes segmented, it has a classical edition, and then there's components where you want to give every component of a text a specific signature, and then it becomes independent of particular publishers. And that's happening throughout the history of philosophy with the Becker and Stephanus pagination of Aristotle and Plato. It happens with Descartes and Leibniz and Kant and Hegel into present day and 20th century philosophy. And that's an interesting moment because suddenly you can study concepts given the signature across the various uses these concepts have in these philosophical traditions. And then you could, for instance,
Let me
say,
just make sure I understand what you're saying. So
sure,
this is something I don't know. I mean, I'm very well aware of the fact that, like religious texts have very carefully numbered different
yeah,
parts and so on.
yeah.
I mean, so you're saying, Aristotle also had that treatment, so to speak,
He has been receiving that treatment by one of his editors uh, in the history of editing. And since then, it's become canonical to cite Aristotle using these numbers. And
I
the
see.
same thing we do in Kant scholarship and in Hegel scholarship.
So in other words, I could say, the metaphysics 1.7.2 or something.
Yeah.
Is that and then what? And that's almost like defining, you're perhaps equating that with something like a concept that paragraph
Well,
1.7.2.
yeah, I wanted to say, for instance, in Kant scholarship, you use the signature as a placeholder for saying, I'm thinking about synthesis in this specific sense, and then I give you a B105. And then everyone is on the board, on board with that particular way of thinking about it. And so when you ask me, what's a concept? That's a question where any philosopher I would work with would ask me, sorry, can you point me to an address such that I can answer that question with regard to that frame of reference?
That's interesting. So, I mean, in my kind of day job world of computational language design, one of the things that, we often use kind of English derived names for things, like we might have a function nest list. And, we've got the English concept of nesting, we've got the idea of a list. And we could, that's just a vaguely specified natural language thing, nest list. On the other hand, as an element of a computational language, it's completely well defined because it's implemented. And every time you use nest list, it'll do the same thing. It is a thing where the quotes meaning of it is how that function is evaluated by the system that you've built, which is
Yeah,
something we don't have on its own in natural language. In natural language, the only thing we do is you say a word, it's absorbed by your brain, and your brain then forms some thought based on that word. And it's in the case of a computational language, it is a much more predictable thing. I mean, the way that a word will impress itself on one particular brain is different from another brain. Whereas one, yeah, so this is a
Yeah,
case where it's really anchored. I mean, in computational language, the idea of something like a concept there, which is like a function, an object, whatever else, is completely anchored because it's just defined in raw computational terms. When you say, a particular section of, Aristotle, for example, then, I guess I would then start asking, but the words that were written on the page in Greek or whatever, different people will understand those words in different ways. I mean, you're concentrating the meaning better by saying, oh, I'm referring to this particular paragraph of Aristotle, but it's
yeah.
still, you still have the ambiguity of natural language, don't you?
Yeah, you do, and then maybe that's a development in mainly 20th century philosophy, you could say. So it starts with Frege, and I'm sure you've had conversations about this, but this idea of having an artificial language in which to express and regiment like so, um, somehow has its limits with regard to the expressive power of natural languages, and that's why philosophy has resolved to refer any dispute to reference frames provided by the history of philosophy in a way. And I was thinking I could rope you into a conversation about this because what you're asking me about translatability, I think has become the object of study in a recent branch of expressivism that is investigating substitution classes among inferences. And that's another way of equivalencing, meaning, and let me say this,
Yeah, yeah.
meaning you try to understand, is the inference from meows and tells me it's late to the cat wants some food, is that justified? Well, in the reference frame of me having a cat, that's fine. And then if I have an Italian visitor, I'm saying the same thing, but in Italian, there is equivalence enough among these languages for us to understand each other, to have been thinking about the same thing. And so you can study equivalence relations as substitution relations where gatto and cat are substitutable for one another. And within your paradigm of computational irreducibility, you could say there is, in a funny way, the arrival of the observer in the Rulliad as an important component because of the standpoint relativity of the legitimacy of certain inferences. And so you could say one aspect of doing philosophy is trying to come up with rules that are generalizable to an extent that are then binding for all observers alike. And so I was thinking, since you're nodding and you understand
Yeah.
yourself as engaged in this, that's very much something that Kant would also try to do. And so, in a way, I understand your enterprise as a computational Kantianism.
That
Um,
could very well be true. I mean, people keep on telling me if there's somebody you should study, it's Kant. And then, I went and bought myself Kant's collected works. They fill a whole shelf, and that was
well, yeah,
very
they do.
daunting.
It's terrible. It's really
Yes.
terrible.
And I open them at a random page and I find him writing about, children learning to ride bicycles and things like this, which is kind of not he wrote about many things. But so let me just try and understand so you're talking about this kind of I mean, I'm trying to understand you're describing what it means to have a sort of robust notion of meaning in some
Yeah.
sense. In other words, you can have different representations of something, but do they all refer somehow to the same thing, or do they all have the same? I mean, I think that and I mean, one of the things I've been thinking about is we all kind of, and I'm sure Kant had many things to say about this, we all kind of believe that there is an objective reality out there. We all have the impression we operate as if there is an objective reality that we all more or less agree about, even though we can't, I mean, it's hard for us to prove that there's an objective reality out there because all we know about is our own inner experience. And yet, there is enough commonality of sort of we can just like we think that other people think more or less the same way we think. They don't. It's like your cat may or may not think the same way as you think, and you are more likely to believe that I think the same way that you think than that you believe your cat thinks the same way, because we kind of have a more of a sort of an inference about how things that seem like us think. I mean, this is obviously being tested in people's anthropomorphism of AIs and so on, where that's a different dimension. But you're saying that this question of you're identifying as a sort of a key element of the enterprise of philosophy, the identification of sort of robust channels of thinking that transcend the particulars, as I understand it, transcend sort of the particulars of different sort of frames for thinking about things. I mean,
Yeah, yeah, you could say a way of introducing Kantian modesty or humility is to say, since people have made outrageous claims about the structure of reality and the language of angels and what God did before he created the world and that kind of thing, it's time that we regiment what we can make legitimate claims about. And so one of the Kantian enterprises there is to distinguish between the kinds of arguments that we can do and the kinds of commitments we can't undertake, really. And so here's one way of introducing this where you can investigate how we represent and what we represent, and thereby find out something about our own capacity. And then that's called a self-directed transcendental argument. But when you try to say something about the necessary structure of reality, you're trying to establish a world-directed transcendental argument. And so the Kantian move then is, and I was thinking this might be interesting to you, is to ask, sorry, what is it that entitles us to take our way of representing things to be a certain way, to be true of the world? And then you have a funny way of saying, well, truth is a muddled notion. I think you're quite right there. And so instead of using a representation relation, you can use an inferential relation and then wonder what types of inferences are, in your language, computationally irreducible. So that's then the
let me
Kantian
try and
take.
take this apart a bit. That's very interesting, but okay.
Sure.
So you're making a distinction between the self-directed and the well-directed inference,
Well-directed.
right? A world-directed. Okay,
Well-directed, yeah.
world-directed. Okay. So self-directed is something that I put the pieces together in my mind, and world-directed is somehow, is it something about the world as it is, or is it something about a necessary thing that follows as a matter of kind of just structural logic and so on? I mean, is it a thing about the world? Is it something that says, for example, there is there are lots of stars in the night sky? That's not a necessary feature. We could be in intergalactic space where there aren't many, stars in the night sky.
Yeah.
Or is it something that is more about, a prime number has, if a number is prime, then it has to be, not divisible by 2 or something. The what's is
Well,
world directed? Which of those is it aiming for?
well, let's say so I meant to get across that the Kantian enterprise is to allow drawing the distinction between arguments that are self-directed because they establish something about ourselves. For instance, that we perceive our movement in time as orientated, or we distinguish regions of space by way of thinking up and down and left and right. So laterality is something, but then that needn't be the case for a being perceiving more dimensions or acting in more dimensions, for instance. So that would be a feature that's primarily a feature deriving from how we are built. And
Yes,
so you can establish these, and you can establish these with some certainty as it works, but that wouldn't necessarily imply that it's true or that it's a feature of reality. And
I
trying to
see.
make that distinction is a very
Right.
Kantian way of thinking about it. And then the even more Kantian way is to then be cautious with regard to the kind of commitment that you can establish as true about reality. And so that's, for instance, the moment where you say the Rouliad is a good instrument for thinking about how structure emerges, spatial structure, temporal structure. And then the question is, what status does that kind of claim have in a Kantian
Right.
frame?
Right. That's a good question. Let's try and unpack that a bit. So I mean,
Great.
you know, on the one hand, you're, you know, this question of sort of whether there is an ultimate necessary reality in some sense versus just the things that sort of we're capable of thinking about. I mean, you're talking about, for example, in the, our sensory apparatus and our size in the universe and so on causes us to have certain views about certain ways of interpreting what's happening in the world. And I guess the question is there a world out there that we are interpreting, that we're taking a mere slice of? And if that's the case, what is the thing of which we are taking these slices? In other words, if we, with our particular sensory apparatus, with our particular cognitive capabilities, we are sampling certain aspects of some whole reality. I'm sure Kant had a word for that. What was it? Did he have a word for that? For what the sort of the whole reality is, that of
Yeah.
which we are
So
sampling pieces?
in Kantian terminology, it's just the world. It's a
I see.
totalitarian concept, as it were, and
Right,
totalitätsbegriff.
but you see, but for me, the world, okay, so the natural laws in Kant's time, he probably thought that Newton's laws were the sort of the laws that cover the whole universe, so to speak, the laws of physics as he knew them at the time. He didn't imagine that our sensory apparatus could sample the nature of our sensory apparatus would cause us to sample one law of nature versus another. I mean, I suspect that in his time, so for me, the totality is much bigger than what one would reasonably call the world as we normally think about the world, because the world as we normally think about it has the laws of physics that we're familiar with. And I suspect to Kant, that was the only level of world that he could imagine. I mean, in other words, I think in his younger years, maybe he worked on things like the formation of the solar system. And, so for him, it's like gravity was the way that gravity was. And then you could ask the question, how would the solar system come to be given those ambient underlying laws of physics? Is that a fair characterization or?
Yeah, although um, there's a specific type of interest in the relation between science and philosophy, and you could say when philosophy matures, it becomes science.
People
And
often
right,
say that, yes.
well, yeah,
Scientists often say that. I don't know if philosophers say that, but scientists
yeah.
say that.
And philosophers have a different way of thinking about it. They would say philosophy is the enterprise of investigating the conditions of possibility of the knowability of a relation as being affected, as being justifiable. So it's a meta-meta enterprise. And so a lot of what you're doing in your work, I would also file as meta-metaphysics. But we need a new prefix
Yes.
there. We can get into the reasons for that. But with regard to that question, there's a different attitude where you say, no, no, look, if you have enough regimentation for the domain to be operable and then applicable, you get a science out of it, and then you call it, for instance, psychology. So Aristotle's book on the soul is the first book of psychology, and then you have that same thing happening for, I don't know, empirical linguistics or different other fields. But in a way, Kant didn't become a physicist, you could say, even though he had lots of thoughts about that. But I'd
Mhm.
like to focus on a different dimension in Kant's enterprise. And I want to go back to your original question, what is a concept? And
Mhm.
there's let's say, three different answers in Kant to this, which I find exhilarating. One is a concept is a title for an object of experience. But then you want to know, is this object experienceable or is it just thinkable? So you
Mhm.
distinguish between the phenomenon and the noumenon, which is, the basis for the things in themselves in a way. That's the is it just thinkable or is it experienceable? And then you would want to know what class or set, theoretically speaking, what set is this part of? And then
Can
you
I
want,
just, sorry, just on the thinkable versus experienceable. I
yes,
mean, in, you know, in brains with neurons and all this kind of thing, we've got, there's at what stage does it become thinkable? That is, there are photoreceptors in my eye that are kind of things that record something which we would normally think of as kind of the beginning of experience, so to speak. Those
yes,
neurons fire.
yes,
Deep in my brain, other neurons are firing. At what point do I cross from something that is experienceable? I mean, in other words, if I have some random collection of neuron firings in my brain, but they were not, if they were directly stimulated by light falling on my eyes, then I can well imagine that that's experience. If they are, you know, at some point, any thought I have probably is in some way derived from an experience that I had. In other words, if I'm going to think about a cat, if I've never seen a cat, never experienced anything about a cat, there's a question, could I form the thought, okay, in fact, I can argue against myself here. I mean, so I'm going to argue that I was going to argue that if I've never seen a cat, I'm not going to form the thought of a cat. But I don't think this is really true. I think you can perfectly well form, you can, in fact, my own efforts in sort of thinking about things computationally, in some sense, if the universe is computational, then anything that can be, you can form as a thought, so to speak. You don't need to have had an example of that thing. You could construct it computationally in principle in your mind if your mind was big enough. Now, I mean, sorry, this is getting a little rabbit hole, but I mean, and you also introduced the idea of computational irreducibility, which I think is an interesting kind of wrench in this whole story, because what you might imagine that you can create in your mind is, let's say that I can start forming the thought of a cat, even though I've never seen a cat, but somehow from some external description or something, I start forming the thought of a cat.
yeah,
And let's say that that is a fairly short computation to form the thought of a cat, then I can do it. If to form the thought of a cat, I need this irreducibly long computation, realistically, in a finite mind, I will not be able to form that thought.
yeah,
So, in other words, there is the idea of computational irreducibility, in some sense, might give you a class of things that you can, in some sense, only experience and not form a thought of. In other words, because what I'm saying is there are things where if if to know what the thing does, okay, so let's be concrete. I spent a lot of time, simulating how simple programs behave using a computer.
you do, yeah,
I I I can't form the thought of what's going to happen in one of those programs. I can only see what the computer does to do it. I
yeah,
can't form the thought of running a billion steps of some particular thing. My computer can perfectly well do it, and it can show me what happened, just like the natural world can run and show me what happens in some particular case. But I can't realistically, with a finite mind, a limited mind, I can't form that thought independently. So in some sense, then that is making a distinction between, and maybe I don't know whether Kant made this distinction or not, the thinkable and the experienceable. I mean, what I'm saying is that computational irreducibility, I think, forces you into a class of things which are experienceable but not thinkable by a finite mind, or not constructible by pure thought in a finite mind.
yeah.
I don't know whether that agrees or disagrees with what Kant concluded. I mean, did he make that distinction of I think you were saying he did make the distinction between the experienceable and the thinkable,
Yes,
and that you could think about fiction or something even though you can't experience it. I think
yes,
what I'm saying is that there are things that you can experience but not think, not construct by pure thought in a finite
yes.
mind.
Yes, and I think on both your counts, there is some advances and precursors in contemporary philosophy of logic. I would love to tell you about, and then also take that Kantian claim and make it work with this distinction between what's experienceable and what isn't thinkable. And
Mhm.
I guess the upshot is that quite obviously some computations are just too large or too vast, like I don't know, higher order cardinals or prime numbers of a certain magnitude, that they would be something that only after long computations can be, brought out into the open. But then some longer numbers are too long for us to even read in a lifetime. That's just as it is, and so I follow very much where you're going with this. But the Kantian distinction between what can be experienced and what can be thought is a distinction that's in a way prior to the operations that you were describe, because you would want to explain the fundamentals of the framework in which you can describe that kind of activity from a Kantian point of view. So you could think of and I was thinking that this is interesting to you because you would want to tell a story of how you get into a perspective such that the Rulliad is of interest to contemporary philosophy and to physics and theology. And then the question is, how do you get in there? And in a similar way, Kant would say, sorry, how do we get into a framework such that we can represent the world and ourselves in it and explain what's going on around us? And Kant would say, well, a good way of thinking about it is to think about the individual perceiving something and then having reasons to take themselves to be caused to do so. But for reasons of Kantian humility, you would say, sorry, I don't even know if I'm scratching my own back or if something is affecting me. And so that distinction between something affecting me and something just being thought of is very primal, you could say. And the point I wanted to get is that the distinction between objects of experience, but then also categories, and categories for objects in time and space, and categories for relations that must be operative such that time and space can come into existence in the first place. That's a distinction such that you can have schematized categories, schematizing whatever is happening to time and space, and also unschematized categories. So this requires answering your question, what's the concept in these three regards? And in a way that introduces a distinction in levels of abstraction. And that's something I wanted to tell you about, because whenever I read your texts, I find that you have a elegant way of jumping between levels of abstractions, which most readers in philosophy are very anxious not to do, because they would want to always make clear what they're talking about. And so, for instance, the Kantian commitment to Newtonian laws is a commitment to the best kind of theory we have for events in time and space, such that we can describe time and space, extrapolating from them. But then he would also try to reason about the kind of intellectual arrangement that would have to be in place such that we can have cause and effect reasoning to be operative in the first place. But that's happening at a different level of abstraction. And I feel that your way of describing the kernel of the Rulliad is very much the same enterprise, trying to understand, sorry, how do we get into this in the first place? And what's true about ourselves such that there's an observer relativity with regard to certain objects of experience or certain laws. And
Right.
that's what I mean to say, that's what makes it look like you're driving towards a computational Kantianism.
That's interesting. I mean, so let me, a few comments here. I mean, so it's one big advantage that I probably have over sort of pure philosophy is I get to do experiments, computer
Sure.
experiments. And so that kind of anchors a bunch of kinds of concepts. And so, where in philosophy you might have to tread more carefully in terms of, what is the level of abstraction you're talking about, at least I have the advantage. I can just, run a simulation on a computer, make a picture, there's some anchoring there that is a kind of anchoring that one is used to in natural science, but I think one has not been used to in philosophy. And I think that helps. Now, it's still very interesting to try and, sort of peel apart what exactly is one assuming as one talks about different kinds of things. And I
Yeah.
think one of the things you were sort of poking at is what kind of a thing is the Rulliad, for example, and in what sense is it, and, we were talking about, Kant's view of everything being the world, so to speak. and my view of everything is much bigger than the world as we, describe it using our standard laws of physics and so on. I mean, I think, um, uh, but so I guess I'm curious now. You're talking about these. I'm not sure that I got the three. I think you were identifying three different sort of kinds of things that one might mean by a concept, and I'm not sure I got all of those things. I mean, you were,
Okay, sorry. Just from top to bottom. So
yeah,
to say S, if S, then P. That's the most general form of articulating a conditional. But
okay.
then
Is that
uh,
is that intended to be in the world, or is that intended to be in pure thought? In other words,
it's intended to articulate the laws that govern our thoughts about conditionals.
okay, but
If
but
you
is
think a
that, yeah?
conditional, right?
But so
There is
that
a
is
way of,
in the sense of logic,
yeah,
where we say, okay, but one of the things that's tricky is that, for example, in mathematics, you can use that kind of implication as a way of sort of making progress in mathematics. You can say, this theorem, therefore this theorem, therefore this theorem, and that is a pretty abstract thing. Now, one of the things that comes out of my efforts is that, in a sense, physical reality also progresses, I claim, by that same kind of mechanism. In other words,
yes.
the progress of time is a progress of what you can think of as, well, the operation of computation,
You
the
say
the
pure computation, yes.
right is just so you're, I mean, maybe this wasn't the direction you're going, but I mean, I'm saying that this purely abstract thing that is the notion of sort of this is derived from that, which you might say is a pure matter of thought, has nothing to do with the world. I'm claiming that is actually the essence of what's happening in the world, and that is the essence of the passage of time. That the
Yeah,
world,
so maybe here's a because I understand that it's good to have a clear image now and then for all of this. So if this is the largest sphere, if this is the matryoshka, with the biggest one, then inside of that will be more nuanced and schematized categories and types of judgments that are tethered to more particular moments in a specific scenario. And so the most abstract one has to be globally binding, such as for us to be able to articulate lawfulness in the first place. And that's the idea of having the abstract category, something that American philosopher Wilfrid Sellars calls pure category. And then there needs to be a schematized category, which is just pure. And then there need to be operations on the ground where you say, if we do this, that much time will have passed. And that's because we are in time and space right here, right now. And it's this discrete amount of operations.
so are you saying that in this view of things, the possibility of even having any kind of reason, philosophy, anything like that, any requires this sort of outer pure category as you're describing it. And
Yeah,
then the particular, so in other words, without that, there will be sort of nothing to say about anything because there will be
yeah,
no kind of formal structure you could ever construct.
yeah.
Um, and so I see. So what you're identifying there is the very notion of the possibility of formalization
Yeah.
is sort of the precursor of everything. And for me, that would be the statement that I guess that the rule exists, that computation, the idea of computation is my kind of notion of the sort of pure category
Yes,
in your
yes.
sense.
So can I ask you something? I would
Yeah,
want to poke you about something. And
please.
in a way we're towards the end of our time, but I'm really curious about this. So this is something I would want to ask you. When you write your beautiful pieces, you have a way of elegantly describing these, let's say, events, operations, processes, happenstances, the if-thens and the one, two, threes. But then, in a sense, there is no logical subject doing this. And you could think of the Kantian tradition as trying to always put that into someone's mind. Now, quite obviously, this could be everyone's mind, and in this sense, you rescue the idea of having put it somewhere. But when you speak about the idea of pure computation,
Mhm.
it's a very abstracted notion because it's not put in time and space anywhere, right? So
Right.
you're
Time and
doing
space emerge from that concept. So in
exactly.
other
That's
words,
why I like your metaphor of crawling underneath the concept of space there for
right,
expressing.
right. No,
But
I mean, so I think the thing you're getting at is
well,
maybe
let me ask
yeah,
it.
go for it. Yes.
In the Kantian sense, you would always say whatever you're thinking, there is the act of thinking, and then there's the content. And no matter how skeptical you are about either, the reality of the act of thinking somehow has to be part of something.
Right. That would be a claim. That's not, I don't like that claim, but let's go on. Um,
Well, I want to squeeze you about that because if you speak
yes,
about pure computation, I want to ask you, sorry, where is that happening?
right. It's a reasonable question, but you know, the tradition of science, what is science trying to do? That is, for example, the natural world does what it does. Science is this effort to have a description of the natural world that fits in our minds. In other words, and so then when I say this is, I have this model of how the universe works, it's a bunch of hypergraph rewriting and so on. I'm not making the claim that there is somewhere a data structure in a computer that is the hypergraph. That is merely my representation of what is actually happening in the world. So, in other words, you're asking, in some sense, you're asking for what, before Newton and Galileo and so on, people always thought that you had to have sort of a mechanical basis for things happening in the world. Like you had to have the crystal spheres, and there had to be an actual crystal sphere, so to speak. Whereas what Galileo and then Newton did was to say, well, actually, no, we can merely use mathematics as a description of what happens in the world. It's not that we believe that, the Earth is solving differential equations inside itself, so to speak. It is merely that differential equations provide a description of what the world what the Earth does in as it moves around the sun or whatever else. So I think, the way I try to think about it is, things about hypergraphs and so on, and even this notion of computation is our mere narrative description of kind of what is actually happening, so to speak. So in other words, I'm not making the claim that computation, in some sense, I'm sort of eliding some things by saying the world is computational. I'm
Yeah.
saying that I'm eliding the fact that computation is our notion of computation, which is a thing that we can think about in our minds, is a way of describing what happens in the world. I'm
Yeah,
not
and I like this a great deal. I wanted to tell you that I've used the notion of a hypergraph in teaching logic and in describing philosophical arguments as traversing the hypergraph, because I found a way of displaying arguments as pathways that can then be recapitulated by interlocutors and leading them to the same conclusions.
that's
And
interesting.
that's an advancement that we didn't have, but it also puts pressure on two commitments on your part. And maybe this is something we could close by, because I would very much like you to take home something out of this conversation, making real what we said initially, that a concept should be, if worked out well, something that stands as a conclusion that can be reused as a premise in a later argument, right? And
Mhm.
so I'm thinking about your observer theory piece, where you estimate that we need multi-way generalization of neural, perhaps nets. And you say that they will become possible on the condition that, and there you say, on the condition that we can atomize neural nets into purely discrete elements. And that's a commitment I'd like to understand better because you will have put some thoughts into this, but the philosopher I work with mostly treats the most simple elements in such a network as elements in a space of reason, where the logical symbols will be concepts. And so concepts will be the outcome of inferences. And then you would want to say inferences in computational hyperspace will be particles in Reulian space, but then they cannot be primitives.
Right. So, okay, there's quite a bit to unpack. I'm happy to go on for a few minutes here if you're able to do
Yeah,
that.
sure.
Okay, so first thing, a comment about sort of hypergraphs and the representation of kind of relations between concepts and philosophical concepts. That sounds like a very interesting thing. I mean, a thing that I've spent a fair amount of effort on is metamathematics and trying to understand kind of, the mathematics as we know it today. Humans have written down a few million theorems of mathematics in the published literature of mathematics. And we can make a giant graph of all possible theorems of mathematics connected by sort of laws of inference from existing theorems. Mathematicians today have just populated a small number of points in that giant graph of all possible theorems.
I like
And I
that, yeah.
guess what maybe you're saying is that, I mean, an interesting question would be, is there that, in mathematics, I think of it as a meta-mathematical space of all possible theorems. And then there are particular theorems that mathematicians find interesting. There are particular theorems that mathematicians want to assume as axioms. And then they have these kind of entailment cones of what do they then believe based on the axioms that they assume. But there is ultimately a meta-mathematical space that contains all inferences between theorems. That meta-mathematical space in the end is the Reuliad, but that's a separate issue. But the point is that so I could imagine if there was a formal structure that you could build for philosophical arguments, that you would similarly have a sort of meta-philosophical space and then given any particular commitment, so to speak, maybe one of your frames that somebody is assuming certain philosophical axioms and then deducing certain philosophical conclusions from that.
Exactly, yeah. So that's what I'm doing.
That's a cool thing. I mean, particularly,
And
I'm very curious to understand how you have a formal structure, because I mean that has been sort of the challenge of philosophy, it seems to me, is that, as you say, the scientists say things go from philosophy, and when they get well defined, they become science. And one version of that would be to say, when they get formalized, I mean, what does formalization let you do? It typically lets you build big towers. If you're merely thinking about things by making, a natural language argument, it's much harder to build a tall tower of inferences. Once you have, a formal structure, you can make a computer build a giant, million layer tower of inferences. But I think you were talking about, and maybe this is for another time, because I think we're going to get talking about kind of the kind of multi-way systems and neural nets and things like this is a kind of a giant. I mean, this question. Okay, so my view of sort of concepts, I guess, has come from different places. One is sort of my thinking about computational language, of being of we have all the details of the world, and we have the things that we manage to think about the world. In other words, all the details of the world have to do with where every atom in your cat is. But our way of thinking about the world is just your cat is wiggling its tail or whatever else. And so, for me, some of what I've done in building computational language has been sort of capturing the world at the conceptual level that we normally think about it in. That is the cat, not the atoms of the cat. That's one thing. And I don't think I've completely, I have to say, I don't think I've completely connected my different views of how concepts work. Because the other thing that I view as being sort of the idea of a concept is, when we think about things, our brains, we've got 100 billion neurons all firing in different ways in our brains. And somehow we manage to concentrate those brain firings into our sort of thread of experience that we can describe with language and that we can make symbolic with a limited number. We can talk about what we're thinking about in terms of a limited number of concepts. We're not saying this is what every one of the 100 billion neurons in my brain did. We're saying, I noticed your cat walking on your desk type thing. And as opposed to, I'm going to describe the precise state of all my 100 billion neurons when I saw the cat walking on the desk type thing. I'm going to kind of crush that down to this sort of concept level of just talking about, the cat on the desk, so to speak. And I view that as being, then the concept is a transport mechanism, a bit like a particle, because when it's doing then is it's saying, I've got all this detail in my brain, and I'm going to package that up into this thing. And what feature does that thing have? The feature that it has is it's a thing that can move from my mind to your mind, so to speak. And that's which is very much like what a particle, like an electron, does in space-time. Is an electron is a package of stuff that can move and still be an electron. It's not a necessary thing. That the idea that motion is possible, and I'm sure Kant had things to say about this, the possibility of motion is non-trivial. That it is possible to have a thing that can move in space and still be the same thing is something that in a physics theory like mine, you have to derive that result. That result is not self-evident. And it won't be true of all kinds of things. And so my sort of feeling is that another, an operational definition of a concept is something that is sufficiently robustly packaged that it can move from one mind to another, much as an electron or a black hole can move from one place in space to another. But I haven't completely, I don't think I've completely connected these different views that I at least have of what concepts are.
So maybe we could continue this, because I see that what Lakoff and Johnson call the conduit metaphor, the packaging, passing on, it's very much in conversation these days in philosophy of information about storing, retrieving, putting things someplace. But what if we reconceptualize the act that is so far described as packaging as making possible for people to walk the same pathway inferentially? So instead of having to think about it in terms of having a suitcase and then passing it on to someone, you would bring people to, as it were, be in the same intellectual movement or motion, and as it were, display the same hypergraph structure because they're being pinged in a certain way. So one question for you. Borges's Library of Babel?
Somewhat, yes.
Yeah, the
You have to remind me
piece.
the precise story, but yes, I've certainly heard of it.
It's a wonderful piece that I would love to have your thoughts about. But there's a funny aspect about it where it's a narrator telling you how they grew up in that library and how it has a specific hexagonal shape. And
so if I'm remembering that story, the library eventually contains everything. Is that right?
Yeah. And one of the features is that it has a select number of shelves in every room with a select number of books, a select number of pages and characters on these pages. And so there's a nesting of complexity, you could say. And one of the philosophers I work with, Wilfrid Sellers, has developed in the late 40s an architecture that's very towering, because you speak about towers there. And I wanted to tell you that it's the most intricate form of organizing textual components by way of title, abbreviation, Roman section, and Arabic subsections, such that every component has an address. And then he begins to cite himself and reuse the conceptual machinery and the inferential paths across a span of some 50 years. And that's quite mad, because any position he arrives at is going to be reused, and be it 40 years later. And that's something I've never seen anywhere else with that level of detail, apart from your notebooks. And you talking about having digitized those things and then
Yeah, yeah,
discovering
right.
that in June
Yeah, yeah, right.
1984,
Yeah, right.
right? So there's a level of granularity in the reusability that's unlocked by having a system of granular pointing and signature for a conceptual node which has a certain complexity that's internally articulated and an embedding that gives this node an external articulation. And so you could say Celis is discovering the usability of a hypergraph before it's computationally implementable. And then you bring the machinery to do that. And I would like us to talk about this in the future.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think one point I have a big advantage relative to, I'm not writing just text and trying to remember what that text meant. I have something, last 40 years at least, I have this precise computational language whose specification has not changed. I mean, its specification has been extended, but it hasn't changed. And so when I have a piece of code that I wrote in 1989 or something, that piece of code still has the same meaning and does the same thing as that piece of code today. And I think that is something which perhaps, in the world of philosophy is more challenging because you mention the identification of particular paragraphs in Aristotle and so on, but it's still the case that there's a certain slipperiness to what does that paragraph actually mean. When you say you use the word category, for example, and for me today, when I hear the word category, I think of category theory and mathematics and so on, which is very different from, the notion of category that I think Aristotle had. And I think that,
Indeed.
and so in a sense, but once one has managed to make the thing computational and make it sort of a thing for which there is a precise computational process that can be defined by it, then you are sort of out of the problem of having to sort of anchor yourself to natural language. And clearly you do better to begin with just being able to say it's this particular paragraph of Aristotle rather than just it's this general idea like the word category that evolves over time and means something different at different points in sort of the development of the English language. I mean, I think the enterprise of formalizing philosophy seems like a very that seems like a very interesting enterprise. I think it's an enterprise in a sense. I'm coming a part of that enterprise from a bizarre direction because I'm coming at it from trying to formalize the operation of the world as the world is through physics and science and so on, as opposed to the philosophical approach, as you were sort of describing it earlier, of things that are sort of, in some sense, general kinds of things that don't depend on, the particulars of the world and so on, that are general patterns of thought. And I think the question would be, the biggest attempt, I would think, historically, to make sort of a way of describing general patterns of thought was logic and sort of Aristotle's approach to logic and so on. And I guess the question would be, as you go sort of above logic, what, is there another waypoint in the formalization of philosophy? I mean, my attempt is to formalize everything computationally, coming from natural science and so on, and mathematical science. And I know there have been attempts in philosophy, whether it's with modal logic or some of these kinds of things, to sort of formalize more kinds of things in philosophy. But mostly those don't feel like they've been terribly successful. I mean, I think that I mean, in other words, the idea of taking, I don't know, the things one might discuss in philosophy and in ethics or something like this and formalizing them is, that seems to still be an enterprise. And it sounds like, if you and this person you're studying have made progress in that, that's really interesting. I mean, I would say that in an area like ethics, one of the things that I find sort of kind of amusing at some level is that one can discuss ethics in lots of different ways, and it's a complicated subject. But if you're writing code for a self-driving car, you effectively, what your discussions about ethics have to turn into an actual computation, so to speak. That's somewhat avoided when you use neural nets. You just train them on different kinds of scenarios. You never really have to formalize the ethics. But in principle, now you can, in other words, you just say, this is what, these drivers did this and this and this. Just do it a bit like the humans do it. Or read the, or as a neural net, read the regulations, read the laws about whether whether it's, what you can, if you swerve to avoid a dog, is a cat, whatever, is that, are you allowed to do that if it causes an accident or some such other thing? In a sense, it's a much vaguer, you don't have to formalize it. But in principle, you do have to formalize it now. There is a definite thing that's going to happen, and it's going to happen repeatedly. And so I think, that's a case where sort of there's a need to formalize areas of philosophy that have for thousands of years, a couple of thousand years, been mere matters of discussion, I think.
Yeah, so here's one way of thinking about let's say the enterprise that you describe as using techniques of symbolically generalizing or regimenting a specific domain of a system in which operations can then be computationally controlled. And you have a specific moment where you say that the mechanics of observation are all about equivalencing, and that would include a meta model that clarifies how that equivalencing is achievable. And I was going to tell you that in contemporary meta-metaphysics, this is particularly relevant, but in a way in which they themselves struggle to acknowledge and realize. So I'm thinking of Karen Bennett and Ted Sider and Amy Thomason and people who articulate resemblance classes for metaphysical kinds, functional equivalences for process kinds, and then speak about techniques of functional comparisons and family resemblance and all that, which is a way of, you could say, approximating what equivalencing can mean. And, you could say that the discipline of logic, as I want to study it on the hypergraph, is very much informed by a recent suggestion to say such regimentation of a system such that it is computationally effective is a decision which itself is driven by a logic. And when you reflect on this, you understand that logic can be treated as the organ of semantic self-consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, this whole question of my kind of base assumption that sort of there are rules that govern things and you can work out the consequences of rules. There is the meta point, or, the meta to the meta point or something of why do you believe there are, why can you even have a framework that talks about rules? I mean, I think, okay, so I would sort of, to address that, I would sort of retreat into the following statement, that just as science is about taking what happens in the world and turning it into something that we can think about in our minds, so similarly, even when you're talking about metaphysics, to have a thing that you can talk about in metaphysics, you're taking sort of, meta descriptions of the world, and you have to turn them into things you can think about in your mind. So in other words, to be able to do that, we have to, our minds are made in a certain way. That is not a necessary feature of the world, but it is a feature, it is, where we happen to be. We have minds of the kinds we have. And so I would say that this idea of representing things in terms of rules is a kind of thing that is our, whatever there might be out there, if we're going to make something that we can think about, we have to turn it into a form like that. So in other words, we're not really addressing the question of what there ultimately is. Just like in science, we're not saying, in Newtonian science, for example, we're not saying how the Earth actually moves. We're saying we can describe the motion of the Earth using these kinds of equations. And so I think I would say that my point of view about this sort of whether rules, whether I'm imposing something I shouldn't be imposing on things by talking about the operation of things in terms of rules, what I'm going to say is that I think I have to do that, because if I'm going to have something that I can talk about at all, because if I'm going to have something that I can kind of manipulate in my mind, I have to have a framework like that. And I'm not claiming that that framework is in any way the only framework that you could use. I could imagine that an alien looking at the Ruliad would describe the Ruliad in an utterly different way, would just say,
Yeah.
would have a sort of faith-based approach to the Ruliad or something that is.
Yeah, I hear you coming down on a self-directed transcendental argument, and maybe you're happy to hear that in contemporary Kantianism, there is the tradition of speaking about logical aliens in just that sense, and then debating to what extent logical aliens would have to be bound by the laws of logic in just the way in which we are bound by them. And then question is, how can you have a meaningful philosophical argument that yields a result that we can all operate on? But the Kantian insight, I think, in the background here that you might be interested in is that I think it's to be found nicely in paragraph 19 of the Critique of Pure Reason,
Okay, I checked that
saying
out.
that nothing is in consciousness unless you have combined it or have synthesized it to be something for you. Meaning nothing which is out there impresses itself on you. It is something for you only after you computationally operate on it. And that's a very deep commitment, meaning also that no categorical status of no entity whatsoever is going to impress itself on you, which in contemporary language is the rejection of the myth of the given. It's this idea that nothing is given to you, nothing wears its categorical status on its sleeve. If anything, it's the result of a certain operation by which we try to determine what we can do with it. And
Right.
that's, I think that chimes nicely with
Yeah,
your.
that was basically the argument I was just making. Right.
Okay, great.
So I'm glad
Hey, Stephen,
Kant got there first. I know you need to go. I should go
see,
too.
yeah, I must be going, but it's lovely to talk to you. I'm very delighted, and I hope we can continue that in the future.
Yes, it was thank you very much for the conversation. And I think look forward to continuing. I'm sure there are a bunch of questions which we were not going to have a chance to, from our viewers, we're not going to have a chance to talk about here. But so, Christopher, thank you very much. And I think it's late where you are, so have a good evening type thing.
Stephen, and you have a good day and talk soon. Bye bye.
Bye.